So if you saw my last video, you may be thinking that the fact that these elections of May 2018 are unconstitutional is only based on the dates that they happened in May instead of December. That is not the case. These elections are unconstitutional because they were rigged. The opposition parties were banned from participating. Their leaders are mostly in exile. The ballots were stuffed and the recount was not allowed. This is why the international community did not recognize these elections at that time, and this is why they're not recognized a new term for Nicolas Maduro, and what created the opportunity for the National Assembly to act on these articles for Juan Guaido to assume the interim presidency of Venezuela on January 23rd of this year. Prior to that, the National Assembly had already paved the way for this to happen. On January 15, they declared Nicolas Maduro in usurpation of power. They also decreed an amnesty for military and public servants who are willing to participate in this transition to democracy, and most importantly, suggested the creation of humanitarian aid channels for support to the socioeconomic crisis that Venezuelans are living. 80% of the Venezuelan population is living in poverty. More than 63% of them are living in extreme poverty, which means that they cannot afford food to eat every day. There's no medication in the country, or it's extremely scarce. Our healthcare system is in shambles, which is creating a public health crisis in the country and in our neighboring countries as well, as an exodus and a refugee crisis in Brazil and Colombia and Ecuador. You may also be wondering, if you're not Venezuelan, why did this happen on the streets? First, it's important to know that in Venezuela, there is no separation of branches of power. Venezuela has 4 branches of power: the popular power, the executive power, the judicial, and the legislative. The popular and the judicial are loyal to executive Nicolas Maduro and not loyal to the state. They are loyal to Nicolas Maduro, which means that the only independent power remaining in Venezuela is the legislative power, represented by the National Assembly, or how many of you know it, the Congress of Venezuela. So it's important for this act of assuming the presidency to have legitimacy. And what gives legitimacy in a process like this is that people agree with it, and an agreement with following the Constitution. But what happens in Venezuela, in difference to many other countries around the world, is our media, our communication, or mass media is heavily censored. So most TV channels are either off air because they're not complying with government regulations, aligning to their discourse, or are heavily censored or self-censored. The only opposition newspaper media that was printing for 75 years stopped printing in December last year because the government did not grant the funding or the approval for purchasing paper for them to continue to print. So our media is heavily censored, which means that people on the streets did not know what was happening. There was no broadcasting on TV of any of this unless you participated on the mass protests and demonstrations that happened on January 23rd, which give Juan Guaido not only by the Constitution legitimacy, by the people's participation in this process all over the country, legitimacy in assuming the interim presidency of Venezuela.